want to speak this morning about emotion. And we think of emotion as a simple emotion, as something very simply felt, which it is, but it's not simple in its complexity, in its composition. If we look at what an emotion is, it's a field of energy that contains a feeling tone, and that is whether it's an appreciated emotion or one that isn't, or one that we just lose our sense of direction within. So there's this disposition to want it or not want it, or just to be lost within it. But it also contains an energy of thought that perpetuates it. And the thought has to do with an elaboration of the feeling tone, but also it incorporates a kind of history that we've had with this particular emotion. Now, at this point, a simple emotion then turns into a state of mind. And I differentiate between an emotion and a mind state, because the mind state is carrying on a complexity and a posture to life that the emotion doesn't necessarily hold. The emotion, as it arises in the day, is one of many emotions that come and pass through us. They don't tend to have quite the earth-shattering effect upon us. They may be temporarily felt and pass through pretty easily. But a state of mind has a historical basis, a memory component, around that feeling and emotion itself. And some of the more obvious ones are depression. If you have had a history of depression, when that sense of sadness comes up, or despair, or hopelessness, it doesn't come up as just an emotion and tied in with a thought. The thought has a whole history and chapter and story with it that remembers depression when I was young. It remembers my mother being depressed. It ties in a whole continuity and posture to it that represents much more than a simple emotion or a thought associated with it. And it's these states of mind that are seemingly intractable within us, because not only does it carry a prolonged sense of the mood in our history, but deeply embedded within its root system are self-assumptions about us, because we've gone through so many different scenes of us carrying this particular state of mind, that in each place that we have associated ourselves with this state of mind, there grows a hardened belief system, self-belief, associated with it. So that depression isn't just what it is. It has to do with a whole history of having taken medicines and being dependent, and a fear relationship. And so it also has a secondary component of often fear associated with it. So it's not just the sadness or the despair, but then there's a fear component to it as well. And that exaggerates its significance. And as the significance gets exaggerated, so does the complexity of thought, and so does the entrenchment of the self-belief within it. And it catches us off guard because we have associated so deeply with our identification within those states of mind. We're so deeply identified with them that there's very little room or space for awareness to enter. The stronger the identity, the more pressed up against us is that particular mood. And there's no space around it. There's no sense of perspective to it. And so when these states of mind arise, and again, Emotions are a little bit different in that we can just, they're transitory, they're things that are passing through. We've coupled ourselves to them a little bit through identification of I, me, and mine, but pretty generally, an experienced meditator can deal pretty effectively with their emotional life. With their states of mind, that's something else. That's something else. And it requires a resolution, a resolve to explore it, that many of us, that's where our courage wanes. We'll feel it. We're willing to feel it topographically. We're willing to feel the texture of it. We're willing to get a sense of it in ourselves. We know how much it's driving us, which is all good in the sense that it gives us a little more perspective of it, but we're not willing to end it. Partially because it means so much about us. It is so deeply identified, like a twined rope, so deeply identified with this state of mind as being my history, who I am, that I have developed within that state of mind a whole disposition of my life, an attitude about my life through it. And so it doesn't just represent even a state of mind, it represents a whole way life is in my own relationship to it. It's a whole posture to life. And can get very deeply embedded as we become more aversive to it and more resistant to seeing it to its end. Because to see it to its end in some ways breaks a kind of ownership, a sort of relevance that it's had in my life. That in some way this state of mind is so compellingly me, and I get a certain reactivity from others, and there's so much familiarity in the reactivity I get from others in having this state of mind, and perhaps that can be anywhere from pity to disgust, it doesn't matter. I get identified from other people's reactions to me in having it and in my own disposition and history with it. And so when I look at the possibilities of uprooting this thing, I hesitate because it means so much to me. Even though it's unpleasant. Even though the attitude which is formed around it has been severe and negative. Still, when I'm depressed, I put the shades down, I turn on the sad music, and I lounge within that feeling. To base myself within the familiar. In some ways, the familiar has more comfort even when it's an obnoxious familiar than the uprooting into the unfamiliar. But at some point, there may be a bottoming out to those states of mind that have driven us our entire life, where we shake ourselves awake. And a courage and a resolution of heart comes. And this resolution of heart, may I say, you can't do without. This is an accompanying component of the heart standing up for its own integrity, for its own fulfillment. And when that arises in us, when we have looked across the landscape of what this attitude, this state of mind has done to us, because, as I mentioned, the state of mind turns into an attitude. As we have begun to see the confusion and conflict that is caused, both internally and externally, and how everybody has had to bend over backwards to compensate for our attitude, then there can arise a resolution of heart that says enough. At that point, we are willing to go to the very root system itself, not just the topographical, textural approach to awareness that many of us hold. Not just rubbing the texture. Now, based within this state of mind are deeply, deeply embedded and engrossed sense of assumptions about ourselves. What I call root assumptions, because they are at the root of holding us within this pattern. I can't. I'm a mistake. It's all up to me. It's hopeless. And as we begin to move into, just through the yearning of heart to resolve it, that calls it forth. The willingness to resolve it calls it forth. There's nothing we need to do to bring it closer than what it is. It's already there in full glory. But when we stop wanting to milk it, then it comes forward. It comes forward and starts showing us the embedded assumptions. And it gets hot because there's so much history and accumulated conditioning within it. And memories often are associated with the willingness to resolve this. And the memories start coming out, and they're not pleasant necessarily. And the ingrained statements that have been made for us throughout, or to us throughout our life around this particular state. And the injunctions that positioned it to its depth. Those also are beginning to be heard. And you hear the cry of self within that state. To go back, to go into those states of mind is to go backward in time when we calcified what was said to us as being true. Very much like looking through the universe at the distant stars is to go back through time, even though the star light is present and current. Even though this emotion is present and current, we are somehow going back into our history as we recover these self-assumptions. And you can also feel the tenderness and naivete, the innocence from which they were received. And the willingness to hear, to attend to that depth of pain, that depth of sadness, that depth of scarring. To listen, to turn one's heart, to turn one's ear towards one's heart. To listen anew to what is being said by myself to myself for my own continuance. To listen. To listen from awareness, not with awareness. We want no buffer in this listening. We want none of you within this listening. This is not the suspension of judgment. This is beyond judgment. We have to listen beyond the dimension of judgment. Beyond the dominion of judgment. And then the uprooting happens. And then the score is settled. The task is finished. And believe me, you don't miss it. Not even for a second. No matter how much history you've invested in it, you miss it not. Because when that's uprooted, what opens up? What meets that uprooting? Is no longer history. You miss it not at all.